know you can see, I don't know if you can see us.
I can.
I don't think you can, but it's mostly it's our foreign liaison officers that are assigned here at Training and Doctrine Command, and some people who work at Training and Doctrine Command and our Army Futures Command. So there's a small group here. We have about somewhere between about 130 in a moderated chat room and more people watching you. So you're famous right
Thanks for that.
as we go forth.
Thanks for that.
So people that are in this room or online, I will remind you that all of the bios are at the TRADOC Watch page. So you can read the bios. I recommend you read Colonel Moerkens' bio because it's very good. I like it. It's expressive is what I would call it. But he has extensive experience in places like Angola, Balkans, Afghanistan. He has worked in different places in military and even at the strategic level, sometime in what in the U.S. we consider to be our State Department. So it's a great opportunity to listen to or to hear Colonel Moerkens. His presentation is titled Will the Dykes Hold? Which is very interesting and a great grabber of a title. So, sir, you're up, and then after you're finished, we'll ask questions, and we thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you very much for that really kind introduction. I'm going to turn my screen slightly so that you can see the whiteboard on which I'm going to scribble and talk about that I put up there. Like I said, the title. And this is the kind of dike that we in the Netherlands refer to, and I know that in the Anglo-speaking countries, dike might have a different meaning as well, which is also a subject I would like to talk about, but maybe not in this audience. So security is of great concern for us, the Dutch, and to make sure that we are secure, we build our dikes. And not just the dikes, the ones that I've just drawn, but there are a number of other dikes that are for us interesting as well. And the development around those dikes will also direct our future and also direct what kind of capabilities we should have. One of the dikes I would like to talk about is NATO. So for most of the Europeans, NATO is something. The army, you are part of NATO. If I speak to a US colleague, and I say, well, I'm in NATO, maybe 80% of my US colleagues have heard about the term and might have done a tour of 2 years in NATO. For a European military, it is your lifelong time you are part of NATO. So for that, it is for us the security alliance, the dike, that should keep us safe. And of course, NATO has its pros and cons, and so does the members. If you look at the figures of the military within NATO, and I would make a divide between the US and the European countries, you would see that the US has about 1.4 billion military which they could contribute to NATO. If you look at the EU or the Europeans, then we talk about 1.5 billion soldiers. If you then look at the amount of money that is spent on NATO, then the Europeans only spend 1/3 in comparison to the US. And by that, we do not keep to our agreement that we should pay up to at least 2% of our contribution. And with that, you could say we make our dike vulnerable. The question is, what can we do about it? And is there a need to do something about that? One of the discussions that we have within in Europe is, what are the political developments going to be in the other countries within NATO? And of great interest is, of course, the United States. will the current president continue in a second term? And what will that mean for the alliance? Will it actually mean that the US stays committed, be part of our Dyke? Or would it mean that the US withdraws, which means that we will have to do something as Europeans with our Dyke? Either pay up to our 2%, make sure that the US stays aboard, or actually organize ourselves better and become more effective. Of course, 2% is just a number of money, but doesn't say anything about your capability. But that we can become more efficient as Europeans, that is something we Dutch truly believe on. And we have also taken initiatives to do so, especially with our partners with Germany. And although we have a mutual history, the Germans and the Dutch, of course, in different variations, we have sought a cooperation which is unique within Europe, and I think actually unique within the military world. If you look into one of the German divisions, in that division, you will find fully integrated a Dutch brigade. Within that Dutch brigade, you will find, again, fully integrated, so no difference in SOPs, in all kinds of regulations, a German tank battalion. Within that German tank battalion, you then will find a Dutch tank platoon. Within that Dutch tank platoon, in reality, if they go on an exercise, you could end up with a tank driver being a German, the tank commander being a Dutch, or in what mix you would choose. And I think that is a way forward that should be sought within the European theatre to become more effective. We can go on with 27 different army staffs, 27 different ways of doing our operations, but that means that we do have more soldiers who are not a coherent fighting machine as maybe the US is, but it needs courage to develop initiatives like that. It also means that we have communal army boards now and then with the Germans. We look into procuring the same systems, whether the contract is initiated by the Netherlands and German buys out of our contract, or we buy out of a German contract, that can both be done. We've also seen that if you work together as military, and of course you need political backing, but it's for the politicians also a moment that they realize that they can make decisions in the national parliament, but they do have to do that together with the parliament of the other nation. And we think this is one of the ways forwards to remain effective in the future battlefield. If not, we will fall apart and be incoherent. One of the other dykes that we have is actually the integrity of our human body. But we're not sure if it's going to stay that way. And of course, the Dutch are known for being forward-leaning. If you would touch the subject, and you can think about what you will, abortion, the use of drugs, space cake, free sex, Amsterdam, you name it. We are a country that is willing to, experiment quite easily. And I think in the future, we will have to ask ourselves the questions, what kind of people and what kind of soldiers and military do we want to build? I stress the word build. If you now look at technology, for instance, mini cameras, I'm sure that my grandchildren will not be fiddling around with spectacles or putting lenses in their eye. They will go to the shop, probably online, and order an eye electronic with which they can, read a newspaper that is 10 clicks away of them. And they will look at me as a granddad and say, why would I bother with spectacles and all that other stuff? And the technology is out there. And I'm sure that there are other countries that might have less moral high ground than we do. There are people who have a lot of money will start buying that technology and implanting that in the human body. We will have to ask our questions. If others do that, if the opponent is able to replace the legs, and I'm not talking about an exoskeleton, I'm talking about real robotic legs. So the android, and the androids are already with us. I don't know if there's anybody in the room with a pacemaker. If you have a pacemaker, you're an android. But we will see that development going faster and forward. So we will have to ask ourselves, what will we do? Are we going to step into that? Are we actually going to think how we do that? Or are we going to be surprised by others that are far ahead of us? Luckily, we've also got experience in that. Nowadays, when the wounded come back, we can replace arms. We can actually replace them with robotic arms, where two robotic arms, if they touch, it is transmitted into a sense back in the brain as touching. So this is another Dyke, the human integrity, the integrity of the body, that is something that will go down, but we have to make sure that we keep up with that part of the technology. Another Dykes is, let's say, all kind of international mediation mechanisms. Those Dykes that we thought would be there in place forever, but we've seen changes going in there. If I look at the development when it comes to the World Bank or the IMF, where China has now, a couple of years ago, introduced the Asian Infra Investment Bank as an alternative to what we know within the Western countries is one of our bases where we can actually discuss things and level out. Look at the recent developments when it comes to the World Trade Organization that has actually recently lost her relevance. From our view in the Netherlands, we see a lot of these international institutions eroding more and more. And what does that mean to us? That means that we have to reconsider how we are going to do business with each other. Are the ones that we do business now actually the players that still matter? We've got an eye looking into China. And although many people might find that Russia should be the obvious, opponent coming to invade the Europeans, we're not so sure about that. We're actually more moving to the east. Not that China will invade us, but they are going to play a different role. Their announcement of being back as the center of the world in 2040 is something that we see happening on the European continent. We see harbors being bought up by the Chinese. If we look around our vital infrastructure in the Netherlands, we have seen that plots of lands are now owned by Chinese. What does that mean? What does that mean for us and our future and our military? Let me tie into the fact that the Netherlands government has expressed a wish that within 2030, so many percent of our cars should be electric, which, of course, for Mother Nature is a good thing. But if you want to have all those batteries, you need to have the raw material to make them. And these raw materials, cobalt, one of them, found in the Congo, other places of Africa, is no longer owned by that country. We see that the Chinese own large amounts of these materials. So what does that mean for us? If we want to make sure that we can, go to an environmental friendly environment, do we then go to the Congo and take that? Do we then head on with China? Do we come into all kinds of proxy wars? And if that's in Africa, what does that mean for our composition of forces? If you look into some of the cities in Africa, you will find mega cities up to 60 million people, which is the total population of the Netherlands. How do I operate as a military in that city? It's easy to win in a city, but it's very difficult to win the city, to get the people on your side, and to make sure that you do get access to these raw materials. So that means that one of our brigades has now been tasked to focus on combat into dense environments, and especially in large cities. Coupling to this, we are also looking into space. And space is something that might be far away. We have a number of things that we depend on space. We have a number of things that we bring into space. When it comes to mini satellites, I think we're way ahead as the Netherlands. But when it also comes to ground materials, and if you look into the space policy, I was talking to one of my Chinese colleagues, and he asked, how far or what are the Dutch doing when it comes to space policy? Well, I said, well, our own policy is looking towards 2035. And he just smiled, and he said, well, our space policy is looking towards 2035. So we're looking more than 200 years ahead. And our ultimate goal is that space, you will have to go through Beijing. So if that is the world outside, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for the international institutions? Who are we going to deal with, and who are we going to fight over when it comes to raw materials? Another dike is what we call the truth. Well, the truth is out there, they say. I'm not so sure about that. If I look at the large amount of people that actually follow a certain leader, opinion leader, a certain belief through especially social media, everything what comes with that, especially part of the hybrid warfare, I'm not so sure if the truth is actually the truth. The truth is that whatever somebody wants to believe, chooses, and that makes sure that they will get that information by just clicking on those sites that actually tell them what they want to hear. But that brings us also to a situation where we think that something can quickly change an attitude, can quickly change an environment, also in the Netherlands. Does that then mean that we had to start learning to operate again on our own ground, within our own country? Does that mean that we have to build up more resilience within the nation? Do we need to change and become also a school of the nation as the military? Do we need to be better in explaining that we are the last man or woman standing when it comes to it? That's one. But on the other side is, if we think we have the truth and the others don't, how do we make sure that they also get our message? Do we go back to the time when we had freedom radios that were broadcast over the Iron Curtain? Do we actually change our laws so that we are able to have our own troll factories that actually put out the truth into other countries? Should we be better in organizing that? Those are questions that we have not yet found the answers to, but it is something of importance. Connected to that is the fact that the Netherlands is the main port Europe when it comes to any connection of internet. The number of cables coming into the Netherlands and all the data centers that are currently within our soil is something of a great concern, because as soon as those shut down, we will see a different attitude in Europe and also in the connections of that. So for that is for us as military a very important task to make sure that we safeguard those internet hubs that are within our nation. Another dike is technology. Of course, we built small dikes, we had some windmills, and nowadays are all high-powered. We can have high-level sea risings, and big arms will close off the harbour of Rotterdam to make sure. So that we have understood and learned that technology is something that helps us to remain safe. We've also understood that the number of population in the Netherlands will not keep on expanding. But if we want to keep up our military posture, if we want to live up to the 2% norm that is agreed upon within NATO, we need to find ways to make sure that we can deliver those effects with less people. And this is one of the things where technology, we think, is going to help us. And we've set out a number of goals where we would like to see within 15 years that we are able to deliver the same effect with an infantry company that normally a battalion delivers. So those are tasks that have been given out to the various expertise centres within the Royal Netherlands Army to see how that could be possible. The same goes for logistic and the same goes for energy. But that also opens up difficult discussions. Should nuclear power actually be part of the army? We think it's normal when you go to a submarine. We think it's very understandable when you go to large ships. But if we would take a mission like Afghanistan and we would have a nuclear power plant fitting in a 30-feet sea container, that would have freed up a lot of soldiers who were just guarding convoys, making sure that we can have the diesel that we want. So we think that in technology there are far more solutions that we are currently taking use of. But we've also noticed that where the military used to be at the forefront of new developments, we haven't got the money and we haven't got the sources anymore to do so. So that means that we become followers. We will have to look into civil companies. We have to tie into them on a different way so that they will help us. Which is all fine and good when you talk about companies in the Netherlands. When they become international, it gets difficult to share their knowledge, but also to make sure that their knowledge is only shared with us. If you go beyond Europe, we see these same technology developments in countries that are not bounded by ethics, they're not bounded by all economic agreements, and they can develop their technology far more faster than we can. So how do we take that on? Do we drop our ethics? Do we just get on with it? Do we need to find other international partners to squeeze out the fact that this technology should be banned? That's one of the things that also keeps us awake. We think we still need to find a good solution to make sure that the dikes that we do have do not break. Another dike we have is climate. And people in the Netherlands say, well, if the sea level rises, when this glacier melts, we will be 2.5 meters above. That's true. Personally, I live about 4 meters below sea level. So a drought wouldn't be a bad thing. So these 2.5 meters will be done. But if you're looking worldwide, a city like New York will receive more water when the sea level rises 2.5 meters and have more troubles than us here in the Netherlands. So it's not just a problem for our lone countries. But we do see that changing. We also see changes like big burns like in Australia or in South America. And those are affecting our climate. Those are making the sea level rise. And it brings us to a point as military, as nation, that we have to think, is this something that will let happen? Or does that mean that we will have to go abroad to countries that do not keep to international regulations and that actually have an effect on climate? Because in the end, our dikes might not be high enough to survive. And of course, we do like to work with the Germans. I don't think we're there yet to actually massively go into Germany. So I've just given you an overview of some of the dikes that we think are protecting us, some of the dikes that we think need a bit of attention, but that's okay. because we're also the country of Hans Brinker. And of course, for those who don't know Hans Brinker, and I think Hans Brinker is maybe more popular in the US than in the Netherlands, but this is this little guy that came by a dike, and saw that there was water coming out of this dike, and put his finger in that dike to make sure that the Netherlands would stay safe. And that is also one of the main roles we as Netherlands Defence Forces, but also part of the wider community, think we should play. We should make sure that we find innovative solutions to safeguard the dikes, and so that they will not break. So far, a short overview of what we think, what if the dikes break? And I'm open to take any questions.
Can you hear me loud? Can you hear me
Barely,
okay?
but understandable. Barely, but
Yes.
understandable.
I'm loud, so we're good. That was a phenomenal presentation, and I really like the way you use Dykes as a visual. In your country, that means a lot to you, and many of us, what we know about the Netherlands are the dikes. So I think that was a very effective tool to use in your presentation. Those dikes being people, NATO, international organizations, climate, truth, and technologies, I think resonates well with things that we talk about. But just to highlight a couple of things, for those that are on the MadSci lab, one of the things that Colonel Moerkens talked about was people, and the U.S. Army has recently written Cyborg 2050 by some scientists in our Army Research Lab and some of our other labs. If you go to the MadSci lab and search Cyborg 2050, and I know the online community, this has been shared with them by in a moderated chat room, there's a great piece in here about people, and there is actually a discussion around ocular improvement, just as you talked about, sir. So your example you used is one of the examples talked about in that assessment. Also, when you talked about truth and ethics, and we talk oftentimes about the asymmetry in ethics, where potentially we have commonality with our allies on many of the ethical questions, but our adversaries might look at that differently when it comes to what truth is, or how technology can be used, or who might more quickly move towards the enhancement of humans. So these are things that we have several articles at the MadSci lab that if you're interested. Also on the technology side, there is an effort ongoing in the U.S. Army to study a smaller unit that could be capable of creating greater effects. There was a DARPA presenter at our Cockrell School of Engineering conference last year that you can go and see his video online if you're interested in that study. And then also there's been an ongoing effort on small nuclear power on the tactical battlefield. And there's an article on the MadSci lab, and our U.S. Army G4 did a study recently on what mobile nuclear power would mean. So just to hit on a few key points. So, sir, I'd like to start off with the first question, and then we'll open it up, but I have a series of questions for you. The French officer earlier that presented talked about interoperability. And from a French perspective, he talked about the desire to have interoperability within NATO down to the battalion and company level. My sense is his description of interoperability would be classically one that we would understand, meaning the ability to share information, share targeting information, intelligence information rapidly, communicate so that we can move in parallel advance and those types of things. You described a different approach with the Netherlands. Your approach of interoperability is full connection within the German army. Which is different. In one way, the French way would be you would still be tied to just one political entity if you decide to use force. In your way, it ties the Netherlands political structure to the German political structure on where military force would want to be used unless it was a NATO mission. So how do you see interoperability broadly? You see it the way you've described it with the Netherlands and the Germans, or the French?
I think that's a good question. I think it's the same. It's only a different way of approaching it. We noticed that, especially in Europe, when it comes to interoperability, yes, it would be good if we could connect our IT systems, that we could share any information when it comes to targeting directly from one nation to another nation. That would be ideal. And what we can achieve in the civil world, where you can use your Samsung phone and you can phone somebody who has an iPhone and you can just talk. In the military world, together with our industries, we've made that impossible. They can develop the best radio for each nation, but also make sure that that radio doesn't speak to the radio of the other nation, even if it's produced by the same company. So we said, well, we can talk about that a long time. Try to get them agreement on the table. Try to get our political leaders to understand that they should be pressuring the industries to make sure that we do connect, that we do have that interoperability, that we do have the same standards, that a medical officer of country A is actually allowed to give medical aid to a soldier from country B. But nowadays, all kinds of national regulations prevent that. So we've taken a different approach. We said we're going to stop talking about that. We're going to just do it. If you put units together, you put them in the same barracks in various countries, mixed of two nations, and you get the politicians to visit them because they like to show off a project and say, oh, look at us, we've got real, two nations working together, and it's good for politics. Give them a nice picture in photograph together with the German minister, the Dutch minister, German soldiers, Dutch soldiers. But they also are then directly confronted by those own soldiers saying, well, this is strange. I've got a German radio in this German tank. I've got a Dutch radio also in this German tank, but we can't talk to each other. Ministers, why don't you fix this? And that has actually put a number of things on the agenda. And one of them is called 10, which is a tactical edge network. Both ministers have now signed an agreement, is that the next generation of IT will be developed nationally, both by the Netherlands and by Germany. There will be no difference. And in that way, we do create also interoperability. But it is by putting pressure from below and actually confronting our leadership with real problems. Not just talking about that in theory, but showing it in practice, that there needs to be a solution. I hope that answers more or less your question.
Yes, we have a question from the virtual community, online community.
Colonel Moerkens, is your path to coalition interoperability best achieved through NATO, the European Union? And what are the challenges you face as a member of both organizations?
Our belief is that it's best achieved through NATO. NATO is a cornerstone of our alliance. And of course, there's EU within that, and we're a member of both. And depending on the mission, it could be that we are deployed under NATO flag or under the EU flag. But we also have something that's known as the Berlin Agreement, where the EU can call upon those facilities of NATO, like the C2 structure, to actually work with NATO in an EU setting. Does it sometimes pose difficulties? Yes. When operating in Bosnia, in an EU mission, I was given and I was working in Naples at that time, at the Joint Force Command there. And of course, what the EU selected for me as my J2 was somebody of a non-NATO member. Well, that gives difficulties. So those are things that we still have to, dish out and come up with solutions. Something we do not want in the Netherlands is a doubling of the same organization. So I would not strive for a NATO and an EU as two separate organizations where we have to build up twice as much forces for each of them. Those should be coming together in a more natural way. So I do not directly believe that we should have a European army, or we should have an army of Europeans that can operate within NATO. That answers the question, I hope so.
Yes, sir. Very. I like that last piece. That was pretty powerful right there. Truth is one of your dykes, and truth is one of your dykes that you have on the board, and this is actually will come up in several of the presentations later. The German presenter, there's a part of his presentation on influence, operations, and truth, and the Canadian presentation is heavily based on influence operations, which gets to the level of truth. As far, this is, overall, it's a whole of government approach because the attack against truth is outside of just the military. But what is the Netherlands military's role in that, putting your finger in that part of the dike, the truth part?
I think there are a number of aspects on that. As military, we have started actually to again revive maybe what Sun Tzu already educated, is that finally any fight is about winning the perception of the other. And the perception is not just change through military ways, as in steel on steel, but more and more nowadays that change through your beliefs. So what is happening inside the head of your opponent. And that means that we have reorganized our thinking on that subject. We have put that more on the forefront. And we are changing from where maneuver was supported by fires, where nowadays we see that fires is going to be supported by maneuver. And with fires, I don't just mean artillery. I also mean information maneuver. And we've actually made steps in professionalizing that part of our armed forces. To give an example, later this summer, we will see a new regiment within the Netherlands Army. And that's a regiment called Information Maneuver, where we have put together bits of cyber, psyops, information operations, communication, which was a hard one, because the communication community says, well, we cannot be part of the cyber community, because then they will be thinking that we are manipulating the truth. But also communication is a way of putting your message outside in the world. Those different entities are put into a regiment. You might think, well, how important is that? That's just, a different organizational chart and you put them together. But there's also a psychological part in that in educating our troops. We've got two different types of regiments in the Netherlands. The fighting regiments, like infantry, cavalry, artillery. And we've got the supporting services, also regimented, like medical, logistics, etc. This new regiment, we have especially put them not into the supporting part of the regiments, but into a fighting regiment, because we see information as firepower in nowadays operating. So that's how we are going about that. And that also means that now when you start into the army, you can actually enlist and have a professional career in information maneuver. It is a recognized regiment with its own careers, with its own schools, etc., etc. So that's how we professionalize that. And of course, everything we do within information management has to fit into a whole of government or a whole of coalition approach to make it effective. And we are currently also doing experiments in some of the mission areas that we have nowadays, but also within our territories in the Caribbean. Because if you want to learn on information maneuver, it's difficult to put that in an exercise. You actually need a live audience to learn. And that is something you cannot, at least not in the Netherlands, simulate easily. So those are some of the steps that we are making when it comes to information maneuver and how we can actually get the truth out there. Thank you.
Colonel Moerkens, one final question. You'd mentioned intercommunications was a difficult problem. Question is a follow-on to that. How in the future operational environment will we seamlessly operate with our allies when we
So I
have
can't hear
disparate
you.
systems in the form of robotics?
So I can't hear you.
I beg your pardon, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Bear with me, we just scrolled. So the question is, building on your earlier statement that the intercommunications between allies is difficult, it'll be even more difficult in the future operational environment given disparate robotics and AI systems. Can you address that, sir?
I don't know if introducing robotics and AI makes interoperability and communications more difficult. It's just another, piece within your weaponry that you can use. I think the difficult part in that, when it comes to robotic and automatic or autonomous systems, and we have set up a special unit to experiment with that, is where does ethics come in that? And where does artificial intelligence get a role? And is that something that we have to develop as an army? We are currently actually saying, well, maybe not. We do need to experiment, but we will need to take the knowledge of artificial intelligence out of big firms like in Google, like in Apple, or when it comes to developing self-driving cars. The logarithms that are in there will have to make distinctions on, am I going to crash myself? Am I going to save that child? Am I going to save that 80-year-old lady? Or none of the above? Well, that way of decision making and how the wider community deals with that, what they find acceptable, is heavily going to influence what we are allowed autonomous systems to do. Whether that man is going to be in or out the loop is going to be part of that discussion. But that is going in a far, far faster speed within the civil world that we can keep up as military. So that's where we see ourselves as followers. But we do need to do experiments, and we do need to engage with our politicians, because there's also this special layer when driving a self-driving car is more acceptable than a weapon system that chooses to fire because he is programmed that way. So we need to be in that discussion. And one of the choices that we have made is that all algorithms that are going to be in our weapon systems have to be open. We have to understand how that works. So there can't be hidden parts in it. And that has meant that we have said to some of the companies in the Netherlands is that we will not work with you. We understand that you want to keep your code secret. But we, as military, have to make sure that we can tell Parliament why our autonomous systems did fire at that moment. And we can't say, well, we don't know sure, because part of that algorithm is a company secret of company A, B, or C. So that's where we stand when it comes to communications and robots.
And the black box artificial intelligence and the algorithms is an ongoing international discussion, especially with the group that wants to ban killer robots, which you're probably well aware of because it's mostly a European-based group. So that is something that that is a common discussion. So I'm glad you brought that in. It's a key aspect of this discussion on technology. And also, it's a constraint that you've put on yourself and many of our other countries will put on ourselves that potentially adversaries will not, which gets to an ethics connection that you alluded to. So this asymmetry in ethics that we've talked about sometimes. So, Colonel Moerkens, this is a great presentation. I think you are the first whiteboard presentation ever given at a Mad Scientist conference. That we've had people do like theatrics and some different things, but you were the first whiteboard presentation, and it went great. We are proclaiming you an Army Mad Scientist. You will get the documentation of that in the mail in the near future. and with some additional what we call in the American Army swag, which you can put around in your office or wherever, which will be a great talking point about why you're a U.S. Army mad scientist now. And then also really appreciate you connecting with us. One of the reasons we're doing this is we're trying to identify people outside of the U.S. that are thinking about these problems. And now you're on our short list because the topics you talked about with deep understanding are things that are often talked about in the U.S. Army. So you've been very helpful today in that way. So that was your last question, and we really appreciate it. We'll disconnect. The last thing I would ask, if you have not filled out our global OE survey, which is at the MadSci lab, do that and share it with your the people you're connected to in the Netherlands, and as we try to get a better international understanding of what people are thinking about the operational environment. So we'll make sure you have that link if you haven't seen it. It's also at the MadSci lab, which I hope you and your compatriots are subscribed to. So once again, thank you, sir. Have a